Welcome back to Soy 101. In this section, we're going to cover the different learning objectives that are related to the 4 principles of integrated pest management. The previous segment, we talked about what a pest was, what we do to use integrated pest management for. Here we're going to cover also the concepts of economic threshold, economic injury level. In other words, why we have these different action thresholds that we use for our different insect pests. And we're going to understand the 5 tactics of integrated pest management. These are the different tools that we can use to control our different insect pests. The 4 principles of IPM, the first one is management. Once again, as we discussed previously, we don't want to eradicate the pest necessarily. We can manage those pests that are below a level that we can be comfortable with. And each grower, each producer has a comfort level, a risk level that they're willing to take. Plants have a natural ability to tolerate certain levels of injury. We can go out those. You can have wind damage from hail. You can have hail damage. But plants all have an ability to tolerate those different levels of injury. We can reduce pest impact and injury by managing pest populations below economic damaging levels. Once again, we're tying in economics. Here we have to have a value to the crop, and those insects are causing some loss in value. And pest management needs to work in harmony with natural enemies. Once again, the integrated section. So once again, we're managing the pest. We have to have some kind of justification. Pesticides are only used when justified by a cost-benefit analysis. Our insects are going to cause loss to our yield. We're going to then justify why we need to control those insects. It takes into account the ability of the plant to withstand a certain level of injury without yield loss, and the economic and other costs associated with applying pesticides. If we use an insecticide, buying the product itself costs money, putting it out costs money. Either running your own tractor is going to cost diesel, or you're going to have an aerial applicator put it out. This is all part of that economic cost benefit analysis. So within that justification, we have 2 different terms that we use in integrated pest management. Economic injury level. This is the lowest population density of a pest that will cause economic damage. Now typically when you're going to a different producer meeting, you're not going to hear much about economic injury level. What you're going to hear about is either action thresholds or economic thresholds. These are pest populations that are at a level which we need to take a control action to prevent economic damage. So we have this economic injury level where we know we're going to cause economic damage. The economic threshold or action threshold has to be before we reach that. The ET, economic threshold, is always lower than the EIL, the economic injury level. This is to allow for sufficient time for measures to have an effect. If we put out an insecticide, some insecticides, such as insect growth regulators, will take 3, 4, 5 days to have an effect. Pyrethroids, on the other hand, can quickly kill a pest. We talk about integration. Once again, these need to be several different types of tactics used. We're not just going to use insecticides by themselves. We're going to use all appropriate pest management tools and tactics. And this recognizes that using a combination of tools and tactics is more effective and cheaper than just using one tactic by itself. We use different multiple ways to use to control. This is more sustainable and eventually leads to less insecticides being used. And contextualization, part 4. Pest management strategies for one pest must be integrated with strategies for all other pests. So if we're talking about soybean, we have our insects, we have our 3-cornered alfalfa hoppers, our stink bugs, lepidopteran pests, but at the same time we have our different plant pathogens, our Cercospora, Asian soybean rust. We may also have our different weeds that we need to control. So we're going to use all management strategies must complement each other and not interfere with each other. They must be compatible with our agronomic practices. So in other words, we can't have a pest management strategy that's just not going to work and use that we're going to not be able to harvest our crop at the end. And these pest management strategies should minimize the impacts on the environment. Once again, we're trying to reduce our impact on the earth so that our agricultural production systems can be sustainable for years to come. The 5 tactics of integrated pest management are biological control, chemical control, cultural control, genetic control, and physical control, and we're going to go through each of those and define those. First one, biological control. This is using natural enemies. As we covered in part 1, what a natural enemy is. We're going to use our natural enemies to control our pest populations. We could deliberately introduce and establish new and natural enemies into an area. We can augment the release of those by rearing those in the lab and then releasing those natural enemies. And we can also help biological control by providing alternate food sources and habitat. So here's where you have banker strips or things that you see along the road can be used to benefit natural enemies, where you can provide different food sources, overwintering sites for them, because most of our agronomic fields are being turned over year to year and replanted. Chemical control. Here's where we use our pesticides to control pest populations. What we want to do when we use an insecticide is you're going to select the least toxic compound, which will provide satisfactory and economic control. Once again, satisfactory control, that depends on what you're comfortable with, and economics, in other words, the cheapest probably product that you can use to get the best yield that you're going to have out in your field. Factors to consider, of course, are pest life stage, efficacy, selectiveness of the product, commodity, and harvest timing. Not all different stages of an insect pest may be actually damaging. Different insecticides work in a different way. That's where their efficacy comes through. They have different selectiveness. The commodity, some products, you're going to have to follow the label on that insecticide. Some commodities might not be labeled. And harvest timing, most of these insecticides have a pre-harvest interval time that you're going to have to wait before you can actually go through and harvest that product. Cultural control. These are modifications of crop environment to decrease pest dispersal, establishment, reproduction, and survival. And you as a producer are already doing those. We see a lot of environmental and cultural control occurring. These can be crop rotations. That's why we don't plant soybean on soybean on soybean. Different planting dates. These can be used for different cultural control. The earlier planting dates that we now have for soybean in the south provide less damage for our lepidopteran pests, but we actually see more stink bugs occurring because we're planting earlier. Different fertilizer rates, these can affect the different health of the plant, and as we said, the healthier the plant, usually what you're going to see is more pest damage. And tillage, these can all have an impact on integrated pest management. Genetic control, using plant varieties that tolerate or are resistant to the pest through traditional breeding or genetic modification, or direct genetic manipulation of the pest. From this, what we see is that we have a very good example would be BT crops. We also have corn resistant to head smut. And we have something called the sterile male technique, which was used. And what you do here is you lab rear insects, the males. You then sterilize them through radiation and then release them. What they're going to do is when they're going to mate with a female, they're competing for mating status, they're competing for reproduction, but since the males cannot produce sterile sperm, you don't see any reproduction occurring. And physical control, these are practices that prevent pest entry, dispersal, survival, and reproduction. Here, many of you may have used a bed net to protect you from mosquitoes. That's a type of physical control. Row covers that go on top of plants can control pests from entering. Mulches, just simply disrupting the landing rate of your insect pest by providing a different mulch around your crop can really prevent that insect from coming in. So in this section, we covered the 4 principles of integrated pest management. We covered the concepts of economic threshold and economic injury level, and we covered the 5 tactics of integrated pest management.